Now we're going to be looking at the Freedom Now campaign. And the main idea for this section is that the quest for civil rights became a nationwide movement in the 1960s as African Americans won political and legal rights and segregation was largely abolished. Our learning objectives is to analyze the strategy of nonviolence in the civil rights movement. Civil rights workers used several direct nonviolent methods to confront discrimination and racism in the late 1950s and early 1960s. These included boycotts, sit-ins, and freedom rides. Many of these nonviolent tactics were based on those of Mohandas Gandhi, a leader in India's struggle for independence from Great Britain. American civil rights leaders such as James Farmer of CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, and Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others shared Gandhi's views. James Lawson, an African-American minister, conducted workshops on nonviolent methods in Nashville and on college campuses. The sit-in movement. 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, stayed at their seats at a Woolworth lunch counter after being refused service because of their race. Over the next few days, protesters filled 63 of the 66 seats at the lunch counter. The students were dedicated and well-behaved and ended each sit-in with a prayer. Over time, protesters in about 50 southern cities began to use the sit-in tactic. The freedom rides. In 1960, the Supreme Court ordered that bus station facilities for interstate travelers must be open to all passengers, but this ruling was not enforced. CORE sent a group of freedom riders on a bus trip through the South to draw attention to the situation. Mobs angry at the freedom riders' attempts to use white-only facilities firebombed a bus in Anniston, Alabama, and attacked riders with baseball bats and metal pipes in Birmingham. Now looking at the results of these nonviolent tactics. The sit-ins succeeded at getting businesses to change their policies, and it marked a shift in the civil rights movement. It showed that young African Americans growing impatience with a slow pace of change. Leaders formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC. The freedom rides. After savage beatings in Birmingham, bus companies refused to sell freedom riders tickets, and CORE disbanded the freedom ride. Federal intervention. SNCC continued the freedom rides. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent federal marshals to Montgomery to protect the riders. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally forced the integration of bus and train stations. Now we're going to look at the integration of higher education in the South. By 1960, the NAACP began to attack segregation in colleges and universities. In 1961, a court order required the University of Georgia to admit 2 African American students. Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes suffered, but both graduated in 1963. In 1962, James Meredith tried to enroll at the University of Mississippi. He arrived on campus with 500 federal marshals and was met by 2,500 violent protesters. President Kennedy went on national television to announce that he was sending in troops. The troops ended the protest, but hundreds had been injured and 2 killed. A small force of marshals remained to protect Meredith until he graduated in 1963. In 1963, the governor of Alabama physically blocked Vivian Malone and James Hood from enrolling at the University of Alabama. And now we want to look at what role was played by Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama in the history of civil rights. Local officials in Albany, Georgia ignored the Interstate Commerce Commission's new integration rules. Birmingham, Alabama was known for its strict enforcement of segregation. So, the Albany movement. SNCC began a sit-in in Albany's bus station. Over 500 demonstrators were arrested. The federal government was informed but took no action. Local leaders asked Martin Luther King Jr. to lead more demonstrations. and to gain more coverage for the protest. He agreed and also was arrested. The results. The police chief, Laurie Pritchett, had studied King's tactics and made arrangements to counteract the nonviolent protest. When the press arrived, King was released and city officials would only deal with local leaders until King left. Once King left, officials would not negotiate at all. The 9-month movement failed. Now we can contrast this with what happened in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King raised money to fight Birmingham's segregation laws. Volunteers began with sit-ins and marches and were quickly arrested. King hoped this would motivate more people to join the protest. White clergy attacked King's actions in a newspaper ad. And then King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. Fewer African Americans were willing to join and risk their jobs. The results? A Southern Christian Leadership Conference leader convinced King to use children for his protest. More than 900 children between the ages of 6 and 18 were arrested. Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor used police and firefighters to break up a group of about 2,500 student protesters. The violence of Connor's methods was all over the television news. Federal negotiators got the city officials to agree to many of King's demands. And here's a quote from the letter in the Birmingham jail. Dr. King said, quote, "Why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." Another incident that happened in Birmingham, Alabama was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was bombed on Sunday, September 15th, 1963. The explosion at the African American church, which killed 4 girls, marked a turning point in the U.S. The 1960s civil rights movement had contributed to support for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So now looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With regards to President Kennedy, the events in Alabama convinced President Kennedy to act on civil rights issues. Kennedy announced that he would ask for legislation to finally end segregation in public accommodations. Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was shot dead in his front yard. Ku Klux Klan member Brian De La Beckwith was tried for the crime, but an all-white jury failed to convict. The March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, the largest civil rights demonstration ever held in the United States took place in Washington. More than 200,000 people marched and listened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Passing the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson supported passage of a strong civil rights bill. Some Southerners in Congress fought hard to kill this bill. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law on July 2, 1964. The law banned discrimination in employment and in public accommodations.